Hey everybody, welcome back to class. I'm glad you made it back. This week we're shifting gears. We're going to be talking all about organizational culture. Now, chances are by now you've heard a little bit about organizational culture. Maybe you've even read a book or two. But we're going to go deep. We're going to go into the deep waters of organizational culture. So get your swimming trunks on because we're going to go deep this week. We're going to talk about defining organizational culture. We're going to talk about different models of organizational culture. We're going to talk about different ways of looking at culture. We're going to talk about ethical culture. We're going to talk about national culture. And moreover, we're going to talk about your role as a leader in changing and influencing and shaping culture. Not easy, but necessary. And it's your job, leader, to be the culture changer, the culture influencer, the cultural mover and catalyst. So, hang on to your hats. Now, I got to apologize ahead of time. This video went a little bit long. I had a lot to say. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just did. Maybe I'm not sorry. Maybe this is really what I wanted to communicate to you as my student about culture. So hopefully you'll appreciate it. Comes in at about 50 minutes. You might want to go pop a fresh bag of popcorn with this one and enjoy it. Or maybe take a break halfway through and then, go get a fresh beverage or something and come back. It is a little bit long. I apologize. No, I don't apologize. I'm so ambivalent. I'm so torn between whether I think I did the right thing or not. You be the judge, all right? You watch it, and afterwards you conclude. If you're still awake at the end and you're still interested and excited and taking copious notes, then I think I did the right thing. All right. So blessings to you. We'll have a little wrap up at the end, but I hope you enjoy this. In this presentation, we'll cover the following topics. We'll define organizational culture. We'll look at several models, pictorial representations of what culture is. We'll talk about creating and influencing culture. We'll talk about the socialization process into culture. We'll talk about national culture and Geert Hofstede's dimensions of culture. We'll talk about ethics and culture. And we'll talk about different types of culture. So let's start off by defining culture. Let me give you a couple of informal definitions here that might resonate with you. Culture is all the things that you do that make your group unique. It's the shared values, symbols, events, histories, and stories that make you unique, unlike any organization. And it's what gives your people a sense of belonging to something different and something special. Culture is the way we do it. We do it this way. So when you think about how people perceive life in your organization, that's what they'll say. They'll say, this is the way we do it. And it's almost like ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It surrounds us, and it's hard to define. And this is the challenging part about culture, is it's so pervasive. We're so used to it that we really can't define it. It's sort of like asking a fish, what is water? What's water, fish? I don't know. And, in the meantime, he's constantly surrounded by it and swimming in it daily. It's so pervasive that we really don't even think about it. It has to do with assumptions and take it for granted, values, etc., etc. And really the way that we get an eye on culture is by going to a different one. And so surely you've had that experience of starting a new job, going to a new church, and you say, boy, this is surely different than it was at my last place. This is a lot different. The managers are different. My coworkers, my colleagues are different. It looks different. They act different. They behave different. They seem to have a different set of values. So when we go from one culture to the next, and those of you who have gone on cross-cultural trips to other countries, you certainly notice it the minute you get off the plane how different the culture is from the one that you left. So the best way to get an eye on what your culture is actually to leave and see what somebody else's culture is. And you come back and you realize the way you do things is not the way that it's done everywhere else. Now, Edgar Schein was one of the early researchers and thinkers about organizational culture. And by the way, let me just kind of make a connection here with org culture and the larger sense of culture studies. We said early on in this class that anthropology is one of the social sciences that are the underpinnings of organizational behavior. And so we can see it most clearly here. Anthropologists were the first people to go from one culture to the next and to see how people behave differently, how they had different worldviews and rituals and myths and stories and all those sorts of things. Well, Schein was one of the first guys who began to take that concept and use it to describe and explain what takes place in an organization. So his definition of culture is that it's a pattern of basic assumptions that are invented, discovered, or developed by a group as it learns to cope with the problems of external adaptation and internal integration. And it's something that's worked well enough to be considered valid. And it's taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. Okay, so at the root of it is a basic pattern of assumptions, unspoken realities, taken for granted realities that we all just believe to be true. And it helps us to cope with problems of adaptation, in other words, change, of making things work internally, and it's worked well enough to be considered valid. So if it doesn't work, something does not stick around in the culture very long. And it's how new members are assimilated into the culture. And we'll talk more about this in a bit. So, what's the importance of culture? What does it do for members? Well, Trice and Beyer believe that culture and organizations arise to solve the problems of uncertainty and ambiguity in social order. It provides organizational members with a more or less articulated set of ideas that help them individually and collectively to cope with all these uncertainties and ambiguities. And so think about it. What if you showed up to work one day, your church one day, and all of a sudden things were completely different? The leaders acted different, the place looked different, you had different history, different stories. It would be confounding. And so culture is sort of this historic buildup of what we believe to be true, the way we think about things, the way we articulate things, the way we relate to one another. And so when we face new problems, new situations, we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel about what we think is important or what is true. We already have an underlying set of values that is going to help us respond to new situations. It's not a rationally based belief system. Rather, they're implicit sets of taken for granted beliefs, values, and norms, more emotionally charged and resistant to change than rational beliefs. And so this is part of the challenge, and we'll talk about changing culture in a bit here. But right off the bat, you could see that because culture is not rational, it's taken for granted, it has to do with norms and values, it's not something that we can just wake up one day and say, hey, I think we're going to change our culture. And a lot of people try to do that. We would love to think that all of a sudden we could just architect a new culture. But it's more resistant to change because it really is rooted in a pervasive set of ideas that have built up over a length of time. And so changing it takes a length of time. And you'll notice in this slide here that it's not rational. They're not rationally based belief systems. So you may do things that don't necessarily make any logical sense. And I love the old story about the woman who would always make the pot roast, and she'd cut off the ends before she put it in the pan. And she was teaching her daughter how to make pot roast, and the daughter said, well, why do we cut off the ends before we put it in the pan? She said, well, I don't know. That's how my mom did it. And so they went to Grandma's house, and they said, Grandma, why do we cut off the ends of the pot roast before we put it in there? She said, well, I used to have this really small pan, and the only way I could get the pot roast to fit was if I cut off the ends. So it was handed down as a tradition. It didn't really make any sense, but we just believed that was the way we did it. So as you can see by that silly example, and much more profound ones as hopefully we'll encounter later on in this class, that it's not really based upon logic or rationality, but it's based upon tradition, precedent, right, and some of the more mystical, mysterious aspects of our culture. Okay, so what are its effects? So according to this little model here, we can see that culture impacts motivation, which thus impacts efficiency. It provides and encourages stability. The more members share and accept the core values, the stronger the culture and the more influential it is on behavior. All right, so the assumption here is that if we have a strong shared culture, it'll help us get along, to enjoy being together, to be committed to the organization, and thus impact efficiency. Now, Edgar Schein had another way of looking at this. This is his 3-layer model of organization. And I think this one's really important here, right? On the left are just a laundry list of cultural attributes, things like documents, physical layouts, furnishing, language, jargon, work ethic and practice, loyalty, etc., etc. But then he's got it broken down into 3 smaller aspects. And if you look at the bottom, well, let's look at the top one. Artifacts and creations, what we do, right? So these are visible but often not decipherable. So these might be things like the physical layout or the documents or even the language and the jargon. I think most of those are the visible ones there, right? Well, maybe not loyalty and commitment. And so there's the visible artifacts, right? What we create, what we can see. And these are the things we can talk about. These are things that are a little more easy to change. But then underneath that there are the values, and this is what we believe. Now, there's a greater level of awareness of this, and sometimes these become codified or written down. A lot of times organizations, even churches, have some kind of value statements. If you have any sort of mission or vision, right, that's a sense of a value, right? It's sort of a grand proposition about what you're about, what's important. But then underneath, there's the basic assumptions. And this has to do with what is true. What do we not? It's so true that we don't even need to take it. We don't even need to write it down. We don't even need to discuss it. And these are taken for granted, invisible, precautions. And so the challenge with dealing with culture is that you can see here that these things sort of build up. And so because certain things are true at the basic assumption level, we hold certain values, either stated or unstated. And because we have those values, we believe that, so we behave and we create things in a certain way. So let me just give you an example, maybe in a church setting that maybe you can relate to, right? So if you walk into the average church, what do you see? You see a bunch of seats, you see rows of seats, all facing forward. And then you have some sort of platform, and right in the middle of that platform is what we call a pulpit, right? And so the physical layout connotes that what happens up there is more important than anything else because everybody is sitting out there and they are facing forward. And so when we walk into a church, we know what happens. We don't have to say, well, what's up there? Can I walk up there and stand there? Well, of course not, dummy. That's where the preacher's going to come out and he or she's going to deliver the word of God. Okay, so we have the assumption, which is that there's one person who's going to deliver the word of God, and this is more important than anything else we do. We have a value which says preaching is important, which is the word of God is important, which is we get together, we listen to the word of God and preaching on a regular basis. And so the visible layout, right, had to do with the church. So the way the chairs are pointed out. Now you could imagine a different kind of culture, couldn't you? A different kind of layout. You could imagine maybe no pulpit. Maybe you could imagine chairs in a round circle, right? We sit in a round circle and one person opens up their Bible and they share something and then somebody else pulls out their Bible and shares something. Now that might be a bit of collected ignorance there, right? But one could imagine that, right? If the assumption wasn't upon the primacy of the Word of God or the primacy of the preacher, one could imagine that church might look a little bit different. And we can think about businesses in the same way. Some organizations have very open floor plans. There's no distinction between managers' cubicles and the workers' cubicles or middle managers, right? The manager might just be in the same kind of cubie as everybody else. Other places you go in and the manager has this really fancy office corner and it's well decorated and he or she has their own privacy, right? So what are the assumptions and the values behind those things? Well, in layout A, the assumption is we're all equals here. The manager is no more special, is not entitled to any more perks or privileges than anybody else. While in scenario 2, the manager is special, set apart, is deserving of special rewards and perks, and so he or she gets their own office and their own sense of privacy. Okay, so you see how the physical layout there is built upon the values, the value, i.e., the specialness or not of the management, the assumption. We believe that everybody is equal around here, or we believe that some people are more equal than other people around here. Okay, so you see how the physical layout then, just one example, and we could go through a myriad of those, but how that sort of gives you an idea of the outward physical layout being a representative of the values and the assumptions. So again, part of the challenge as students of culture is to exegete the culture, right? We see these things, but what does this mean? What is important? What are the assumptions behind the things that we see? Now, here's another model of looking at this. This is that proverbial iceberg, right? We all know the saying that 90% of the iceberg lies below the surface, and the poor people on the Titanic figured that one out the hard way. And then 10% is up above. So the up above part is what we see, the stories, ceremonies, slogans, behavior, dress, physical setting. Underneath is even the bigger, more vast part, and perhaps even more important, having to do with the values, assumptions, beliefs, attitudes, feelings. Okay, so just another way of slicing it. And one more way of slicing it here. This is sort of based on Schein's model, but you can kind of see it in pictorial view. So inside of the core values, expressed values, and visible culture. So one of the issues that comes up is, how do we create organizational culture? Or can culture be created and imposed, right? As a leader, you might say, boy, yeah, we really need to change things. We've got some new values, new assumptions. We want to do things new. We know culture is important, so I'm just going to come out with a memo that's going to articulate our new cultural values, and this is the way it is. Well, hang on there, leader. You might not be able to do it quite as easily as you think you can. It is difficult to simply create core values. Why? Because those are things that are deeply held, that have emerged over time, over precedent, over tradition. And so imposed values are often met with resistance. And perhaps you've been in a situation where leaders come up and say, well, here's what we're going to believe now. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what's important. And you're like, well, wait a minute. I don't know if I believe that one yet. And so you can't just tell somebody, here's your new value, right? You can't tell someone, here's your new history. You can't tell someone, today everything is changing. We're disregarding everything we've done in the past. So that's, in a sense, what trying to artificially change or create culture is all about. The best way to create culture is in a startup, in a fresh situation, from the ground up. This is why it's so difficult for large organizations to change, because there's just years and years of built up history and values, and you can't change that ship very quickly, can you? So there's often a disparity between reality and a stated set of values, which creates confusion, irritation, and skepticism. So in other words, if you try to artificially impose a new set of cultural values, they don't stick. And so people will say, yeah, we say we believe this, we say we're gung-ho about that, but everybody knows that we are still like this. And so one of the key challenges for leaders really is aligning the reality of the values and the behavior. You don't want to create a situation where people become skeptical because you have this new program, this new docket of ideas, and nothing really changes, right? And so we can see that culture takes time to evolve. And again, especially an older, more mature organization, you might be part of a business or a church that's 50, 75, 100 years old. Well, that thing is not going to change overnight. Now, if it's new, if you're all a bunch of entrepreneurs creating your new thing, it might be easier to change it. But even then, right, you've already got some established time that's built up the culture, and it's going to be a little bit more difficult to change. So there has been some talk about different types of culture, customer service culture, and ethical culture, diversity culture. And again, if one starts at the beginning with these as values that build up over time, then you can, absolutely. We'll look at Zappos in a second, but they're sort of looked at this kind of fun, creative customer service culture. If your church has been around for 50 years and you have your roots in the 50s or 60s, chances are you're going to be more of a traditional, historical type of church. If your church started in the 80s, you're going to kind of look like that boomer church. If you were started in the 2000s, you're probably going to look more like an emergence church or missional church, right? So our roots have a lot to do with what our church looks like in the current day and age. Benefits of a positive culture: increased teamwork, information sharing, better employee morale. So one of the things, while it's not so easy to change culture, you do want to articulate it, and you want to be real about it. This creates a sense of connection and identity for your people. So how do we influence culture change? Can we do it at all? Well, there's been a lot of research on this, and here's some of the themes that appear in the research. You might want to know this. First, cultures are elusive and hidden, so they are hard to diagnose, manage, and change. So don't think that you can go back after listening to this cool lecture and change the culture of your organization. It's difficult. You'll have an opportunity in your final paper in this class to do some diagnosis and submit recommendations, but I wouldn't expect that you actually be able to make any changes in the immediate future. Deliberate attempts to change culture are not really practical. Culture sustains people through periods of difficulty and ward off anxiety. And people naturally resist change to a new culture. Okay, so as much as we love the idea of culture and say, yeah, I'm going to change my culture, here's what some of the research shows on trying to do that. It's challenging to diagnose. It's not really practical to make attempts to change. And it takes a lot of time. It takes personnel change, right? There may have to be some sort of crisis in your environment for people to get real about the new realities. So I mentioned earlier Zappos. They're a pretty well-known business. I believe they were bought by Amazon a while back, but they have this set of 10 core values. Now again, you can articulate values, and I encourage you to do so. Every church, business, organization, what have you, should articulate their core values. And they should align with reality. Sometimes we articulate core values and people look at it and go, huh? Did we just photocopy these or steal these off of somebody else's church? Because we don't do things like that around here. Make sure your core values are genuine, that they come from the heart of the people, that you can point to physical examples of how you really do indeed do that. Okay, so one of the issues has to do with socialization. This is from them to us. So in other words, when people first encounter your organization, they have no idea what it's like, and they're not really an us, right? They're still a them. And so if you're trying to bring people into your leadership team, to your core, even as members or customers or members of your church, they have to go through a socialization process. And so there's ways to look at the structure, or ways to structure socialization. So it happens informally, but it also can happen formally. And this is some of the things that you can manage to a certain degree. So the book talks about collective, formal, sequential, investiture, serial. Now another way to look at the socialization process is in these three ways. So anticipatory socialization, that's a mouthful, say that one twice. Anticipatory socialization has to do with recruitment, using realistic job previews, selection and placement, using realistic career paths, providing detailed information about the organization, the history, founders, milestones. Now, one of the ways you can do this, think about your church, for example, is by describing some of these things in your on your church website. New members classes often have these sorts of things, right? You provide information about the history and success stories and values and all those sorts of things. If you're thinking about hiring people or even volunteers, right? Recruitment has, it plays a big part in sort of fit, people, culture fit. You want to make sure that people understand what the culture is like and that they fit in that culture. So some people, for example, I've seen this type of scenario where somebody just has a real heart for innovative evangelism and missions and missional church, and they're thinking about taking a staff on a church staff position, and the church is very much more structured. They grow slowly. They have some missions, but it's not, necessarily the heartbeat of the church. And so somebody would come in a situation like that be frustrated. They'd be frustrated because they have one set of assumptions and values, and it doesn't really fit, right? So culture fit is an important in this kind of onboarding recruitment situation. Then there's accommodation socialization. These are sort of the orientation programs, teaching people the social skills training, supportive and accurate feedback, especially in the first 3 to 6 months, right? People are going to make a lot of mistakes, going to be a lot of snafus, misunderstandings. If you can help people understand that from a cultural level, that would be great. And then ongoing role management, socialization, provision of professional counseling, adaptive, flexible work assignments, etc., etc. All right. So a couple of questions you might want to think about in your ministry context. What is the enculturation process for your church? What is the impression that people get of your church even before they show up, right? Think about the layout of your building. Think about your signage, the paint on your walls, everything. How well your landscaping is. People will make impressions of your church just based on what they see when they drive down the street. If they see a church that's kind of sloppy and the lawn's growing long and needs a painting, and it's got one of those funky old signs from the 60s and half the letters falling off, people are going to make an impression pretty quick about what your church is like on the inside. Again, a modern way of doing that is through the websites, and then, of course, through our new believers programs. These are all important ways for people to figure out what the enculturation process is. And are you intentional about how people join and become encultured? Some people are, some people aren't. And I think this is something for you to consider as you're learning about culture. How do we help people understand our culture? Now, the next issue here has to do with culture and national value systems. So because any organization, church, business is part of a larger culture, i.e. a national culture, or maybe even a national subculture like an ethnic culture, those things have an influence upon the microculture of the church, so to speak. Organizations operate efficiently only when shared values exist among members. Values are the conscious, effective desires or wants of people that guide behavior. Values are a society's ideas about what is right or wrong, and they're passed along through the education system, religions, families, communities, organizations, right? So the idea here is, how well does your church or business align itself with the larger national culture? And so missionaries have figured this one out, the hard way a long time ago. They would try to import a Western version of church to a non-Western culture, and they quickly realized that it wasn't taking hold. It wasn't fitting in because things were just so different. And so missionaries over the last 30 years have really had to rethink what church is about. What are the essential elements of the church? What is the gospel, the essential message, and separate it from those culturally prescribed attributes. So the example I mentioned earlier, where we all have seats or pews facing in one direction, and we all look up at the pulpit, which is raised up above. Right? Some cultures are much more egalitarian. They don't like to put one person in the spotlight. They're much more of a shared culture. They like to deliberate. They talk about important things together. They don't just sit and listen to one person tell them, right? This is kind of a collaborative a view of things. So Geert Hofstede came up with what are called cultural dimensions. So every culture has these things, but they're sort of a scale to the degree to which they hold on, and these are important. Okay, so let me give you what these cultural dimensions are. The first one is power distance, and this has to do with the idea of how separated one feels from the leadership of a culture or organization, right? So in a high power distance, the followers feel as if they are not on the same plane as the leaders. They cannot speak back to them, they cannot question them, they cannot even offer input. So, for example, Latin cultures, Russian culture, Japanese culture, much more high power distance. The United States, on the other hand, is very low power distance. So we feel, people have the right to speak to leaders. They have the right to chip in. They feel like leaders, put their pants on one leg at a time, so to speak. And so there's really nothing more special about them. In fact, they might even think they got there because of corrupt means or whatever, right? So you can see that we have this, very flat sense of power distance in the West. And, there's pros and cons of this, right? One of the pros, I believe, is that it really lends itself to a collaborative leadership style where a leader can come in and get people to contribute and ask questions and what they think, et cetera, et cetera. If you go to Russia and you kind of sit down with a group of managers and say, all right, tell me, what do you all think? They'd go, well, what do you mean tell you what we think? You're the leader. You're supposed to tell us what you think. right? And so in the West, we have a hard time with that. We're so used to this idea of collaboration and participative management styles and all those sorts of things. Uncertainty avoidance. This is the degree to which people can deal with ambiguity or not, right? Some cultures are much better with ambiguity. Some are much more prescribed. You have to have a ritual and a process and an understanding of how everything's going to take place. Masculinity, femininity. A high masculine culture might be what we call the macho culture, right? Men tend to dominate. There's an understanding that women have their certain role in life, and it isn't in the same place that men have it. Individualism, right, versus collectivism. Some countries are much more individualistic. It's all about the person. Others are much more collectivistic. And short versus long-term orientation, right? Are we thinking about today and tomorrow and next year, or are we thinking about the next 50 to 1,000 years of our culture, right? So you can see how these are also useful in an organization, right? These can describe a lot of organizations, right? So an organization with a high power distance where the leader, the pastor, is kind of exalted above everybody else, and we're here simply to take orders, right? We have to listen and obey. Or, where he or she is kind of one of the gang, and we all kind of collaborate and make suggestions, but at the end of the day, that person is in charge, but he's not necessarily an authoritarian, right? Some of these other things as well. You can see these taking place in an organizational context. And here's some samples of different countries along Hofstede's cultural values there, right? And I gave you some of these. So individualism, America is very high. The United States is very high. No surprise, right? And Indonesia is very low. So if you were to go to Indonesia, for example, with a leadership style trying to incentivize people to work individually, hey, bonuses, individual bonuses or rewards or acknowledgement, right? That's not going to work. It's all about the group there. Let's see, what are some other interesting examples? Masculinity. Japan's very high, and Sweden's very low. All right, let's talk about ethics and culture for a minute. And because, ethics have to do with values, right and wrong, you can see how ethics might be, clearly placed inside of, and how ethics are right inside of a cultural framework. So there's two things. There's one way to look at this is by it's called a multi-systems view of culture. So we've got the formal system, and then we've got the informal system. So the formal system has to do with more of the structure. It's not really culture per se, but it has to do with policies and codes, orientations, training, performance management, authority structure, decision process, right? A little more structured. Some of these are values and culture based, but most of them you can actually talk about, right? You can actually articulate and think about on a formal level, right? That's the difference between formal and informal. Formal simply means something is written down. We all ascribe to it. We've all checked off on it. We can talk about it. We can write it down. As opposed to the informal system, which has to do with some of these cultural things like role models, norms, rituals, myths, stories, language, right? So these are the things of culture there. So the challenge here is aligning those things, right? And so the ethical or unethical behavior lives somewhere in that spot between the formal system and the informal system. So when the systems are aligned, all systems are pushing members in the same direction, either ethical or unethical. With misalignment, members get mixed messages about expectations. Okay, so let me give you an example here. So let's just say that the policy says that we all show up at 8 o'clock and we all leave at 5 o'clock. But we all know that people trickle in, some of the staff get there at 8:30 or 9, and the pastor gets there like at 10 or noon. And everybody has pretty good excuses, but we all know that the practice is not what the policy says, right? So that's a misalignment. What about other things, like use of personal property? And this happens in a church, unfortunately, a lot. The policy says you have to have permission, or you can't use church property for personal things. But we know people come in and they grab a stack of chairs for a party at their house, or they need a new computer for their kid and they know there's one lying around that nobody's using, so they'll take that. Or they grab a stack of printer paper for their printer at home and nobody's going to notice a little stack. It only costs $5 and I'm worth it, right? Okay, so that's sort of a misalignment between the formal system. Let me go back here. A misalignment between the formal system, what the policy says we're supposed to do, and the informal system, sort of the norms of how we really do things around here. So if you have a misaligned system here, you're going to create problems. You're going to create cynicism towards the rules. People won't know what to obey, what not to obey. And you're going to end up with an unethical system. And so it's important then that the leaders become the models of the ethical system, right? So it's what the leader does in an ethical context, so everybody else does. So when the leader comes in late, when the leader borrows things, when the leader fibs here and there, right? They're not big things, but they're just sort of, skirting around the lines of what's ethical. Then that's the kind of culture that's going to happen. And moreover, if people don't hold that person accountable, if they don't say, you know what, I'm noticing something going on here, and this just doesn't seem right. So sometimes people turn a blind eye, and we're not talking about just small things like borrowing a stack of paper. We're talking about big things like borrowing a stack of $100 bills, right? I mean, it all starts with a stack of paper, and before you know it, somebody's buying their own home or their own boat or whatever on the church funds. And so this is where it takes an ethical culture over time to establish norms and values that says we do things the right way. We don't allow that to happen. We don't even allow the leaders to do that, right? Nobody's going to get around some of our stated values of right and wrong here. Okay, so let's talk about the role of leadership in culture. Executive leaders create culture. In a church context, you might say senior pastors, senior leadership, elders create culture. They maintain or change organizational culture. Ethical leadership and ethical culture, you have different types of folks. You have the unethical leadership, you have the hypocritical leadership. So the hypocritical leadership is the one who says, well, here's what you're supposed to do, but this is what I'm going to do, right? And so everybody gets, the idea that, okay, we know what's going on around here. And then there's ethically neutral or silent leadership. So in the ethics world, it's just as bad to not say anything as to be complicit, right? So if somebody sees something, so let's just say you're a leader and you see something going on and you don't say anything, that is what's called an ethically neutral or silent. Or another way to look at it, so that's sort of not stopping something bad, but what about not doing something that's good? Not talking about values, right? So leaders should talk about values. They should talk about why we do the right thing. They should talk about obeying the rules. So ethical culture change, and again, this is a tough one just as the other one is, but you got to take a long-term view, a systems view, to diagnose and audit, to intervene and evaluate. And so you can actually develop ethical approaches. You can have policies, obviously. And again, I think part of the challenge for churches is we sort of assume that we're all ethical people. And I think a lot of us are. But we've also seen horror stories and, unfortunately, things that end up on the front page of the news where pastors and other church folks end up doing something very unethical. Sadly, the Catholic Church is just going through this again, and it seems like it's a never-ending perpetual issue with, child abuse in the Catholic Church. So at some point, somebody's got to say something. Somebody's got to make a systematic change of the policy, of what's rewarded, of what's not tolerated, of not shipping people around from one diocese to the next. And I don't mean to bag on just the Catholics, but they're kind of a good example right here. And it's not all of them, we all know that. But there's some systemic issue, there's some systemic ethical issue that's not being addressed in that context, in my humble opinion. Okay. Let's talk about different levels of cultures in the organization. There's what's called the dominant culture, right? Widely held by many of the people. Then there's subcultures. And this is interesting, any large group is going to develop smaller subcultures of groups of people that believe differently. They're kind of in line with the main culture, but they've kind of created their own little thing. And then there's even what's called microcultures, right? Culture within a culture. So in a church context, what might a subculture be? Well, maybe the youth group or the outreach folks or, the executive leadership team. They've all have their own sort of way of doing it that's different, than anybody else in the rest of the church. And then you can look at what's called the strong culture versus a weak culture. So strong culture is widely held by most people. Weak culture is not deeply held or by not as many people, right? So I think the goal here is to create a strong culture where most of the people would agree and subscribe to the main values and be in alignment with that. As opposed to a weak culture, that's not a good thing, right? There's no sense of shared values or history or norms, and so people kind of are very independent in that sort of culture, maybe don't even stick around. So how do we shape the organizational culture? Through socialization, right? We talked about that, explicit or implicit. And it says here, culture is caught by what members see and is more experienced. It is caught by what members see in more experienced members' behaviors, attitudes, etc. So again, you can't necessarily just sit down and teach everybody everything that you believe. Culture is something that is caught by watching what other people do. So in terms of leadership and culture, it becomes even more important, right? Because leaders are role models, they're more visible, they're typically more respected than other people. And so what they do says sends a loud message about what's important. And so leaders primarily shape culture by what they pay attention to and what they reward. Okay, so what is important? If the leader is always talking about, for example, money and budgeting and frugalness or faithfulness or the tithe, right? Well, what's important to this church? Well, I guess it's about money. Now, at the end of the day, executives are always responsible for that. But if that's what gets talked about on a continual basis, that sort of becomes, the model, and everybody thinks that that's the most important thing there. As opposed to what? The pastor who's always talking about evangelism or missions. What about the pastor that goes out on mission trips twice a year, right? Guess what? That's going to be a missions-minded church if you have a senior pastor that's modeling those sorts of things. Having a missionary come in one day a year and show some slides and ask for some missionary support, that's an okay thing. But having a team, of senior leaders who actually do missions work, who support, missions with a large chunk of the church budget, that's going to create a real missions-minded culture. So you can't say, oh yeah, we're all about missions, but the most that you all do is let somebody come in one weekend a year and talk about missions, right? So that's just a small example. You can think of many, many examples of how what the senior leadership does in a church context is going to determine what's important in that church. And then, of course, what they reward. And not necessarily just financially, but who they give platform time to, who they value, who they kind of do a nod and a hats off thing to, right? So leaders, if you want to shape your culture, here is how you do it. You pay attention to the right things and you reward the right things, because your culture will be shaped to a large degree by what you pay attention to and what you reward. Now, Cameron and Quinn come up with different types of cultures here, and this is sort of another way of slicing culture. We've been talking about it very generally up to now, but it's been noted that there's different types of culture, and Cameron and Quinn talk about 4 different types of culture based upon their focus and whether they're internally focused or externally focused, and how flexible they are, whether they are flexible or whether they're stable. So let's look at these 4 types of cultures. The first one is the Adhocracy culture. This is a dynamic, entrepreneurial, and creative place to work. People stick their necks out and take risks. The leaders are considered innovators and risk takers. The glue that holds the organization together is the commitment to experimentation and innovation. The emphasis is on being on the leading edge in growth. Success means gaining unique and new products or services, and encourages individual initiative and freedom. And this is more common of maybe younger organizations or maybe tech organizations. You think of like a Google or maybe even Apple, right? They're always creating new things. They look at their leaders as innovators and all those sorts of things. Steve Jobs was considered the ultimate innovator and risk taker. Then you have the bureaucratic culture, which is a very formalized and structured place to work. Procedures govern what people do. The leaders pride themselves on being good coordinators and organizers who are efficiency-minded. Maintaining a smooth-running organization is the most critical. Formal rules and policies hold the organization together. Success is defined in terms of dependable delivery, smooth scheduling, and low cost. The long-term concern is on the stability and performance with efficient, smooth operations. Now, a lot of larger, older organizations kind of look like this. And, we use bureaucratic in sort of a negative term, but it really has to do with this formalization kind of idea. And so any organization that's, larger than maybe a couple hundred people, has to become bureaucratic to a certain degree. And so you might look at your church and say, yeah, we're 2,000 people. Guess what? You probably have a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of bureaucratic culture going on. You don't mean to, but, in time, things get complicated. And so you have to create these formal systems so that there's not chaos running loose. Now, the next one is the clan culture. This is a very friendly place to work where people share a lot of themselves. It's like an extended family. The leaders or heads of the organization are considered mentors and perhaps even parent figures. The organization is held together by loyalty or tradition. Commitment is high. Attaches great importance to cohesion and morale. Success is defined in terms of sensitivity to customers and concern for people. Places a premium on teamwork, participation, and consensus. All right, so in all the years I've been doing this class, most of the students in this class will say, yeah, that's my church. We're a clan culture. It's a friendly place. The leaders are like parents, right? And think about it, formally we've always called pastors, to be mentors, or, in the Catholic Church they refer to them as father, right? Father figures, mother figures. Loyalty to the tradition is what holds us all together. High commitments, cohesion and morale, right? So this describes probably most of your churches. And then there's the market culture, a results-oriented organization whose major concern is getting the job done. People are competitive and goal-oriented. Leaders are hard drivers, producers, and competitive. Emphasis on winning, competitive actions, success determined market share, organizational style is hard driving. Okay, so I've never had a church that said, yeah, we're the market culture. But you can see, for example, missions organizations, outreach, really the emphasis is on, new people, new converts, new areas, new nations, having more of that driving. It's not as friendly and warm. It's more about accomplishment of mission. So again, and then there's some overlap too. This chart here shows you a couple of things. It shows you that you're not 100% in one corner, right? You tend to, kind of gravitate towards one or the other, but you've got certain things to a certain degree, right? So this model here is called the competing values framework. So it's not like you're either or, you're just stuck in one. We tend to have a tendency towards one. We model more of the attributes of one than the other. All of them are there to a certain degree. So you probably say, well, yeah, we're kind of clan, but we're kind of bureaucratic, right? There's your mega church right there. We're one big happy family with 20,000 people. So there's obviously has to be a lot of bureaucracy to keep that much stuff going. But, at your heart, you really are about commitment and loyalty and mentoring and all those sorts of things. Now, what this chart shows you here is that there can be values in tension. So look at, for example, the biggest disconnect here, I think, has to do with the hierarchy, right? And so look at the hierarchy. The red is the current. And for this particular organization, the result is 27.83. But the preferred, so the people are asked, what is it like now? And people are asked, what would you like it to be? And so the actual is almost 28. The preferred is 20. So what does that mean? That means there's a big disconnect between how bureaucratic this organization is and how bureaucratic people would like it to be. People would like it to be more of an adhocracy, right? So if you look in the adhocracy, you'll see that number is current is 18, but preferred 28. It's almost the opposite of the other one. So the people in this organization would say there's very little innovation, there's very little creativity or risk-taking, but we would like that a lot more. We would like to be more like that. So if people's perceptions of the current culture is in line with their preferred, there's really no issue here, right? So if all these current preferred numbers were exactly the same, then everybody would be hunky-dory. The problem is when you have a disconnect between what it is currently and what is preferred. So if you live too long in that kind of situation, you're going to start to feel that tension, and people are going to leave. People are going to want to do things differently, and if things don't change in the current culture, then there's going to be some problems, right? So people are going to be frustrated in a culture like that. So here's some questions for you to think about in terms of the culture here, and we'll have some more opportunity to do this in our discussion threads. I'm going to skip this. So let me just come down the home stretch here and talk about this one more time in case you didn't get it. How do leaders shape culture? Organizational leaders have a tremendous impact on the culture of an organization and influenced by what they pay attention to and what they reward. Remember, people do not change their values, for example, by simply being told that they should. Rather, that norms, beliefs, values, and assumptions are usually the product of repeated experiences extended over a lengthy period of time in combination with implicit and explicit reflections on the nature of those experiences and the extent to which they were personally satisfying. And to me, the most important statement there is people won't change because you tell them to. And again, it's tempting as pastors to get up in the pulpit and say, God spoke to me and I've got a new vision and here's where we're going. Well, you're going to have to tease that out. You're going to have to get some buy-in. You're going to have to let the culture develop over time where it can actually sustain that. Now, you have a right to hear from God and you have a right to share that with people. But in terms of your expectations for how that gets accomplished in the church, it's going to take a little more time, a little more wisdom, a little more thoughtfulness, embedding it in the culture, figuring out what the obstacles are going to be. How do I model this change, right? I mean, all these things that leaders do. What am I going to start paying attention to? What am I going to start rewarding? All those sorts of things. It's much more effective. Leaders must understand the only thing of lasting importance that leaders do is create and manage culture. The unique talent of leaders is their ability to work with culture, and the right kind of culture will influence how effective organizations are. Leaders should develop the right kind of culture to match the mission and vision, a culture of quality, and a culture rooted in biblical values, honoring their denominational heritage, value of all members, and is relevant to today's culture. So the bottom line for leaders, if they don't become conscious of the cultures in which they are embedded, those cultures will manage them. So become aware, use the tools, learn what culture is about, use some of the analytical tools, pay attention to it, become a student of the culture of your organization. Well, wasn't that something? I'm glad you made it to the end, though, and hopefully you learned a lot of ideas and important information about culture that you didn't know before, and maybe you got the wheels turning a little bit. Maybe you come to realize how important your role is in shaping the organizational culture. As much as we'd love to sit down and just write out a list of 10 core values, 10 statements of reality, the reality is what's valuable to your church or business is what you do every day. You are the primary shaper and influence of culture by what you do, for better or for worse. And you might think, oh man, that's kind of a scary thought. That's a scary proposition. Well, guess what? That's the kind of leader that God's called you to be, is one who models the right thing, who pays attention to the right thing, and who rewards the right thing. So don't be discouraged. Don't be scared. Don't feel daunted by this task, but do the right thing. Pursue the Lord's vision in your life. And guess what? Maybe you'll develop that kind of culture that He would have you to develop. Not just simply written statements by a passion, but a passion coming from your heart. Something that you do because you believe in it. Something that is the right thing to do, right? Something that's ethical, that's valuable, that is important, that follows your passions, and that gets other people to follow along. Well, anyhow, we're going to have some opportunities to discuss this in the discussion board as well. So I look forward to hearing some of your thoughts and ideas and reflections about culture, about how this influences your own thinking, about the values and assumptions and the behavior of your organization. So blessings all. I'll see you online.